The moving truck had barely cleared the curb when she showed up, clipboard in one hand, a smile like a judge's hammer in the other, and that look people in small towns learn to read. I know the rules better than you do. My name is Ethan Miller, and that was the first day I learned how thin the line is between neighborly pride and outright possession. We had picked the house because it felt like a fresh start, not because we wanted to be dramatic, but because the lot at the end of Willow Lane had history and old family easement, a crooked white fence, apple trees that leaned toward the sun. The realtor had said, "This one isn't in an HOA." The woman with the clipboard, Maribel Hargrove, had decided that that phrasing meant something else, that isn't could be argued, that her job was to keep the neighborhood perfect even if that perfection needed a little creativity. She started small, like most bullies do. An official-looking note slid under the door, violation, stamped in red, complaining about gravel on the shoulder, about a mailbox she called too modern. I laughed it off at first, who wouldn't? But then the SUV started parking at the end of our driveway every morning, Maribel's mask on, sunglasses, hands folded, as if she was conducting a neighborhood stakeout. She'd tap her clipboard and stare. Sometimes she'd call the county about unauthorized landscaping. Sometimes she'd stand at the mailbox and hand the kids in the cul-de-sac a list of rules like contraband, as if civility could be enforced by paper. What I want you to understand is this. It wasn't just rules. It was theater. Maribel made every interaction a performance, and she had an audience of few neighbors who nodded, a HOA board member who showed up at our door like he'd been summoned, a local officer who, politely and without much context, asked us to hold off on the garden lights until everything was sorted. That's the clever part about people like her. They weaponize the ordinary until it feels urgent. There's a private conversation I replay in my head, the one I had with Lisa, my wife, 2 nights after the note. We sat on the back steps among the half-unpacked boxes, the summer crickets filling the pauses, and she said, "You can either let her ruin the first 6 months, or you can document everything and make it so loud the county has to listen." That's when the plan, not a revenge plan, God no, just a methodical, stubborn insistence on the truth, started to take shape. We set up cameras on the porch, the kind you can tuck behind a potted fern. We started a binder, receipts, dates, photos of the same gravel pile a dozen times, emails to the HOA president asking for clarification. We learned that documentation is therapy for the powerless. It gave us a rhythm when everything else felt chaotic. And slowly, the tone shifted. The neighbor who had nodded at Maribel at the stop sign started leaving a coffee on our porch with a scrawl that read, "Saw what happened. Call me." The town, as it often does, was a collection of reticent allies waiting for someone to open a window. Maribel noticed. Of course she noticed. The morning she arrived with 3 men in plain jackets and a lawyer whose card read, Association Counsel. I realized this had stopped being about a mailbox and started being about reputation, and reputation had weight in this town. She looked at me like a general looking over a map and said out loud, with that clipped, precise voice, "This neighborhood runs on standards, Mr. Miller. We'll see this through." Her smile was a closing door. The scene that changed everything was small and stupid and cinematic, all at once. She'd organized a community meeting at the clubhouse, the kind with stale coffee and folding chairs, and she arranged the seating so that she sat at the head like someone choosing a jury. She unfurled a printed packet of violations and read them with performance art precision. She accused us of installing an unauthorized decorative structure, our little stone path to the apple tree, and of creating aesthetic disharmony. People murmured. My stomach went hollow. And yet, when I stood up, I didn't lash out. I didn't beg. I pulled my binder onto my lap, and I spoke in a voice that surprised me with how calm it was. I read the county deed aloud. I read the survey line that put our property exactly where it should be. I showed the photos, the timestamps, phone time, camera time, receipts, and I watched double takes ripple through the room. Maribel's face went from composed to tight, and when she tried to interrupt, the HOA president, who had been her ally up to that point, shifted just slightly, as if hearing a different sort of music. There was a break in the meeting where someone in the corner muttered, "How long has she been doing this?" An older man, Clarence, who'd lived on Willow Lane for 30 years and whose hands were the map of his life in calluses and small scars, said, "Long enough to think she owns this place." That line landed harder than any legal filing. You could see the ledger of years flipping. That's when the escalation happened. It was subtle, then insane. Our garden gnomes were thrown into the street. An anonymous letter suggested we weren't a good fit and suggested a legal resolution. One night, a paint-stained bright, humiliating red splashed across the garage door. The camera had caught a shadow, a hurried silhouette, and a laugh, muffled and triumphant. We filed a police report. The officer who came told us there was probable cause, but suspects? That's the thing about small towns and big reputations. They shelter themselves. I learned, in law offices and county buildings, that the system is patient but can be made to move if you make it inconvenient enough to ignore. You file the right papers, you add a human face to your evidence. You make living with silence unbearable. We hired a local attorney, not some hotshot, but someone who knew the way the county clerk used to take lunch at the diner and who had patience like a shoreline. She looked at our binder, at the photos, and she said, "They can bully you until it becomes cheaper not to, or you can make them pay the cost of being mean." I liked that sentence, ugly as it was. The turning point was not dramatic in a Hollywood way. Nothing exploded. Nobody shouted in the courthouse steps. Instead, the county reviewed the records. The HOA's claims unraveled when the surveyor's old map, the one tucked in a drawer at the recorder's office, said exactly what our deeds said. This plot had been outside their jurisdiction for decades. The HOA had been acting on assumption, on rumor, on a strange, possessive kind of authority they'd invented because no one had asked them to stop. Maribel, when cornered, had two choices: apologize or double down. She doubled down. She sent a certified letter threatening legal action, alleging we had harassed community members by publicizing internal matters. Her lawyer used words like prejudice and disturbance. It was the kind of language people expect in novels, abstract and heavy, designed to make ordinary people think they're the problem. So we served our own notice a countersuit for harassment, vandalism, and libel where it applied, and we asked the county to enforce the recorded easement. We didn't do it for spectacle. We did it because the red paint on our garage had the audacity to feel like a decision. When the county finally issued a formal letter stating their lack of jurisdiction, something shifted in the neighborhood. The day the sheriff's deputy walked up our driveway with a summons for Maribel to appear in court, a few neighbors gathered on their porches like a slow, respectful audience. She wore her blazer, always immaculate, and for a moment I saw, behind the composure, the small part of a person who knew she'd been unmasked. In court, she tried to plead confusion, to frame it as concern for the neighborhood. The judge, who seemed to have grown up listening to people like Maribel, looked at her and said, "Authority is not the same as ownership." What people remember from that day is not the legal jargon or the stapled pages. They remember the look on Clarence's face when the judge read the line about the recorded easement. They remember neighbors who had been silent nodding, and one by one, stories coming out, petty cruelties that had been woven into years like a thread. Maribel was fined for the vandalism after the paint analysis matched the bottle found in a neighbor's shed, and the HOA's attempt to levy a fine against us was rescinded and followed by an apology that felt like it had been chewed up and spit out. And yet, the story didn't end on a tidy note. There's always a residue. People who watched from the sidelines had their own judgments, and some thought we'd gone too far, that we'd publicized a private feud. Others thought the system had worked, justice rendered in a quiet, competent way. Maribel moved out 3 months later, claiming a change in circumstances, but the house she left on Sycamore Drive held a different silence, the kind that comes after a community has stopped pretending ignorance is comfort. I tell you this because the real conflict, the thing that keeps me awake sometimes and makes me grateful other times, wasn't about a path or a mailbox. It was about who gets to decide what a neighborhood is and how easily that decision is centralized in one person's sense of rightness. It was about how ordinary people find courage in small acts: a camera mounted on a porch, a binder of receipts, a clear voice at a meeting, and how those acts ripple into a town's memory. If it made you relieved, say so. Share the story, tell a friend, and if you've got a tale about an HOA, a neighbor, or a small town showdown, I want to hear it. Because at the end of the day, these places are made of people, and people are messy, and that's where the real stories live.